Imagine a city where absolute power and extreme poverty share the same sidewalk, where the smell of incense from temples mingles with the stench of open sewers, a civilization that created law, built magnificent aqueducts, and simultaneously enjoyed watching people being devoured by lions. This isn't the Rome of Hollywood movies. This is the real Rome, brutal and fascinating. The city that shaped our modern world while hiding its darkest secrets. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the truth no history book has dared to tell. What if I told you that this Rome of power and contradictions was even more extreme than you imagine? Look beyond the museum models and polished Hollywood films. Rome wasn't just a city, it was a human experiment that defied all logic. While senators debated philosophy in villas adorned with dazzling mosaics and fountains whispering coolness just a few streets away, entire families crammed into windowless rooms. Imagine walking its streets. On one side, marble palaces reflecting the Mediterranean sun. On the other, the famous insuli, the first skyscrapers in history. Buildings up to 6 stories high, built with cheap materials and even cheaper labor. Veritable death traps where 90% of the Roman population lived. These insulae were architectural nightmares, with no running water on the upper floors, no adequate heating system in the winter. In the summer, they turned into ovens, the constant risk of fire, the inevitable collapse. When an insulae collapsed, and believe me, it happened frequently, it wasn't news. It was just another normal day in Rome, and the streets the famous Roman streets, yes, were paved with impressive technique. Some of these roads still exist today, but what the books don't tell you is that they were also open-air garbage dumps. There was no regular collection. The solution was to throw everything out the window. It was so common that the Romans developed a warning cry, kavanon, which didn't mean beware of the dog, but beware of what comes from above. Imagine going to work and having to be careful not to be hit by food scraps, dirty water, or something much worse. And the noise. Rome never slept. The constant creaking of cartwheels on stone, the shouts of vendors, the hammering of artisans, heated discussions in the taverns that operated day and night. The city was a chaotic symphony that reverberated among the 7 hills. Yet it was in this chaos that beat the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known. City, where the sublime and the repugnant not only coexisted, they fed off each other, creating a culture that, despite all its flaws, still echoes in our lives 2,000 years later. But if you think Rome's physical structure was fascinating in its contrasts, wait until you discover what the daily lives of its inhabitants were like. Forget the imperial banquets you see in movies, with grapes served by slaves and goblets overflowing with wine. For 99% of Romans, the reality was quite different. The day began with a breakfast that would make any modern nutritionist panic. Hard bread dipped in diluted wine, or perhaps a few shriveled olives. Nothing more. Lunch was usually a bowl of barley porridge called pools, consumed hurriedly on the streets or in small taverns where space was fought over with elbows. Meat was a luxury reserved for religious festivals or the very fortunate. Ordinary Romans survived primarily on grains, vegetables, and seasonal fruits. And here comes Rome's smelliest secret, garum, the delicacy that defined the Roman palate. Imagine a paste made from fish, offal left to ferment in the sun for months. The devastating smell, the surprisingly addictive taste, a kind of glutamate from antiquity. Garum was to the Romans what ketchup is to a modern hamburger. It went on absolutely everything. As for wine, yes, the Romans drank it daily, but not in the way we imagine. Consuming it neat was considered barbaric, uncivilized. Roman wine was always diluted with water, often seasoned with honey or herbs, and served both as hydration and as a way to purify the contaminated water from public fountains. Speaking of water, how did one maintain hygiene living in the cramped insulae we mentioned earlier? The answer lies in one of the greatest Roman contributions to civilization, the public baths. For just a small coin, any citizen, rich or poor, could escape the filth of their cramped apartment and immerse themselves in a world of temporary luxury. The baths weren't just places to wash, they were complete social centers. Imagine a combination of gym, spa, library, restaurant, and social club, all in one place. There, among marble columns and beneath vaulted ceilings, a simple shoemaker could feel almost like a senator for a few hours. You started in the tepidarium, a warm room, then moved on to the caldarium, a hot bath, then cooled off in the frigidarium, a cold bath. A slave, or, for the less fortunate, a fellow slave, would shave your body with a strigium, a sort of bronze scraper that removed dirt, sweat, and oil. But don't be fooled into thinking this meant privacy. The Romans treated their bodies with a naturalness that would be shocking to us today. In public restrooms, people relieved themselves side by side, without partitions, while chatting about politics, business, or the gossip of the day. The common sponge, yes, shared, used for intimate hygiene, would be a sanitary nightmare today, but it was simply part of life. This was the real Rome, a society that built magnificent aqueducts to bring fresh water for miles, but where most people lived in conditions we would consider unacceptable today. A world where the collective always trumped the individual, where survival depended more on social connections than on personal resources. And speaking of social connections, nothing defined one's position in ancient Rome more clearly than one's status within the complex Roman social web. But who really were these people who shared sponges in public restrooms and survived on garum and stale bread? Roman society was a perfectly stratified pyramid, where birth determined virtually everything, and whose shadow still cast a shadow over our world. The invisible foundation that supported this entire system was slavery. It is estimated that 1/3 of Rome's population lived under the yoke of captivity, somewhere around 300,000 people in the empire's capital alone, and forget the singular image of the slave chained in the mines. Roman slavery was a diverse and disturbing spectrum. There were domestic slaves who lived in relatively comfortable conditions, sometimes better fed than poor citizens. Educated slaves who worked as doctors, teachers, and accountants, some even managing fortunes for their masters. And of course, there were those in the most brutal conditions, in the mines, in the fields, or trained to die spectacularly in the Colosseum. A slave could be freed, become a freedman, but the social stigma rarely disappeared completely. Rome offered freedom, but not necessarily dignity. And Roman women, here lies one of the greatest paradoxes: legally subordinate, practically powerful. A Roman matron couldn't vote or hold public office, but she managed property, influenced political decisions through networks of connections, and, in many cases, controlled considerable fortunes. In the lower classes, however, women worked tirelessly, as saleswomen, artisans, and midwives, always balancing the demands of supporting a family in precarious conditions. The double moral code, as in almost all patriarchal societies, required virtue and chastity of women. As for men, they were allowed liberties that we would consider unacceptable today. And children, if you were born healthy and into a family, with resources, congratulations, you had a chance. Boys learned mathematics, rhetoric, and Greek literature. Girls were prepared to manage households and produce healthy offspring, but if born with any physical deformity, or if the family simply couldn't feed another mouth, infanticide was a common practice, neither hidden nor criminalized, unwanted. Babies were often abandoned in public places, at best, adopted by another family, at worst, dying of exposure or being taken into a life of slavery. Life was valuable only when useful to the state or family. Religion permeated every aspect of this stratified society, but forget the idea of faith as we know it today. Roman religion was pragmatic to the core, a contract with the gods. You offered sacrifices, performed rituals, and in return expected prosperity, military victory, a good harvest. It was a religion of results, not of spiritual salvation. Every home had its larium, a small altar where ancestors and family protector deities were venerated. Every street corner had its temple or shrine. Every important decision, from marriage to war, was preceded by consultations of auguries and divine signs. It was in this context that Christianity emerged as a disruptive force. The early Christians were not persecuted primarily for their theology, but because they rejected the Roman social contract. They refused to sacrifice to the emperor, to participate in pagan festivals, to accept the established order. For the Roman state, this was not just religious rebellion, it was civil treason. This was how Roman society worked, brutally pragmatic, rigidly stratified, yet flexible enough to absorb exceptional talent, regardless of its origins. A talented slave could become an influential freedman, a distant provincial could theoretically rise to the Senate. And how to control such a complex society where slaves and free men, patricians and plebeians, men and women coexisted in constant conflict? The Roman response was brilliant in its brutal simplicity. Panem and circuses, bread and circuses, distract the people, feed them minimally, and you could rule them forever. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheater, as it was originally called, was not just a performance arena. It was the greatest tool of social control ever invented. Imagine 50-0 0 people from all social classes, though carefully separated, by sector united in a collective experience of adrenaline, blood, and catharsis, the free admission, the food provided by the state, the subliminal message crystal clear, see the power of Rome, see what happens to those who challenge it. Gladiatorial games were far more sophisticated than the simple fights to the death portrayed in movies. There were different categories of gladiators, each with their own fighting style, armor, and specific weapons. There were rules, referees, and yes, sponsorships. Famous gladiators endorsed products, appeared in graffiti on city walls, and had devoted fans among the elite and commoners alike. But don't be fooled into thinking they were only free men choosing this profession. Many were slaves, prisoners of war, or convicted criminals who literally fought for their lives. The arena was the perfect microcosm of Roman society, brutal, hierarchical, spectacular, and with a slim possibility of social advancement for the exceptional. However, the true heart of Roman entertainment was not the Colosseum, but the Circus Maximus, with a capacity of 250,000 spectators, a quarter of the city's population. Chariot racing was the true Roman national sport. Imagine the World Cup combined, with Formula One multiplied by 100. The 4 factions, blue, green, red, and white, divided the city into fanatical fan bases. High stakes exchanged hands. Charioteers became millionaire celebrities, worshipped like rock stars. Emperors knew their power was solidified or threatened, not so much in the Senate but by the reaction of the circus crowd behind. This curtain of bloody distractions, another Rome flourished. In the theaters, Greek comedies and tragedies were adapted to Roman tastes, often more vulgar and direct. In the libraries and reading rooms, poets like Virgil and Ovid refined the Latin language to perfection. At the elite's private banquets, philosophers debated Stoicism and Epicureanism while sampling exotic delicacies from across the empire. This duality was the essence of Rome, a civilization capable of producing the sublime verses of the Aeneid, and the next day applauding the brutal execution of criminals by wild animals. The emperors understood this duality perfectly. Nero was not only a cruel tyrant but also an obsessed artist, forcing crowds to watch his endless performances of poetry and music. Hadrian was not only an efficient administrator but a visionary architect and patron of the arts. The genius of Roman manipulation lay in allowing the people to feel part of the spectacle of power. At public festivities, which occupied nearly half the days of the Roman calendar, ordinary citizens sat close to, though never alongside, the elite. They ate food distributed by the state. They saw the emperor himself waving, participating in the same rituals. The illusion of a Rome for all was carefully maintained, while the reality of a profoundly unequal society was perpetuated. And this illusion was maintained for centuries until the cracks began to appear. Bread became scarcer, circuses more expensive, enemies closer, and then what seemed eternal began to crumble. But Rome's legacy would continue to shape the world long after its last emperor was deposed. While the people were distracted by the spectacle of the Colosseum and the races at the Circus Maximus, something deep was eroding the foundations of what seemed like an eternal empire. Rome, which managed so brilliantly to manipulate its masses through entertainment, could not manipulate its own destiny. What we truly inherited from Rome goes far beyond the ruins tourists photograph today. Every time you sign a contract, you are using a Roman concept. When you look at the calendar, months are named after Roman emperors and gods. When you drink water from a tap, you should be thankful for the hydraulic engineering they perfected. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian languages are all direct descendants of Latin. Our legal systems, our architecture, our concepts of citizenship and civil rights all carry the DNA of Rome. Even our modern techniques of political propaganda and mass manipulation are sophisticated versions of what the Roman emperors did with their games and food distribution. The difference is that we've replaced the Colosseum with social media and bread with consumerism. The method has changed, the principle remains, but if Rome left us so much, why did it fall? Here's the inconvenient truth that textbooks rarely emphasize. Rome wasn't destroyed by barbarians. Rome imploded. Forget the dramatic image of hordes of warriors breaking down the city gates. The process was much slower and much more revealing about the nature of civilizations. While wealthy Romans grew ever richer, building extravagant villas far from the city, the middle class virtually disappeared. Inflation soared. The currency was devalued so many times that it became practically worthless. The army, once composed of proud citizens, became a mercenary corps, often recruited from the very barbarians it was supposed to keep at bay. Corruption became so endemic that public offices were openly auctioned off. The tax system collapsed under the weight of exemptions for the powerful and overtaxation of the vulnerable. Ironically, the same systems that made Rome great, its bureaucracy, its army, its road network, became unsustainably expensive to maintain. The empire expanded beyond its capacity to govern itself effectively. The center could no longer hold its own when the Visigoths finally sacked Rome in 410 after the Dacoid regime. It was more of a symbolic blow than a practical one. The Rome they found was already a shadow of its former glory. The real Rome, the idea of Rome, had already fragmented long before. Most disturbingly, the parallels with our own society are impossible to ignore. We also live in a world of growing inequalities. We also have elites increasingly isolated from the reality of the masses. We also have political systems corroded by money and influence. We also have our version of bread and circuses to distract us from the fundamental issues. Our physical and social infrastructure also shows signs of wear and tear as we continue to expand our global ambitions. Our institutions, like those of Rome, struggle to adapt to a world that changes faster than their capacity to evolve. I'm not suggesting that our civilization is on the brink of collapse. I'm simply pointing out that Rome didn't believe it was on the brink of collapse either. The Roman senator, sitting at his banquet, listening to poetry while slaves served wine in golden cups, probably believed his world would last forever. After all, it had already lasted nearly a millennium, not another 1,000 years. The most important lesson Rome leaves us is not in its monuments or its laws, but in its fall. Civilizations are not eternal entities. They are fragile organisms that require constant maintenance, reform, and adaptation. Complacency is the first symptom of decay. We, like the Romans, are perfectly capable of building technological marvels while ignoring fundamental injustices. We are capable of creating sublime art while tolerating everyday cruelties. We are capable of theorizing about the nature of the universe while failing to solve basic problems in our own societies. Rome is not only our ancestor, it is our mirror, and perhaps also our warning. The mirror Rome offers us is not just a reflection of the past, but a window into our own future. This civilization that built roads that lasted millennia failed to build a system that would survive its own excesses. And in this paradox lies perhaps the most valuable lesson for us today. When we walk among the ruins of the Forum or contemplate the magnitude of the Colosseum, we are truly looking at monuments of warning. They are not just architectural marvels, they are landmarks of a civilization that believed too much in its own immortality. What did you find most surprising on this journey through royal Rome? It was discovering that those white marble statues we admire in museums were originally painted in vibrant, sometimes even garish colors, or perhaps learning that ordinary Romans lived in such precarious conditions while their leaders squandered fortunes on palaces and spectacles. Or perhaps it was realizing how many of our current problems, inequality, populism, environmental degradation, institutional corruption, were already present a millennia ago, just in different forms. The history of Rome is not merely an academic curiosity or entertainment for history buffs. It is a civilizational survival manual. Every empire that emerged after Rome studied its rise and fall, trying to learn its secrets and avoid its mistakes. The Byzantines, the Carolingians, the Ottomans, the British, the Americans all saw themselves at some point as inheritors of the Roman legacy, and all invariably repeated many of the same mistakes. Perhaps because the fundamental lesson is so simple, it's easy to ignore. Civilizations don't die from the outside in, they die from the inside out. It's not external enemies that pose the greatest threat, it's internal fractures, unresolved inequalities, institutional arrogance, and normalized corruption. Rome wasn't defeated. Rome exhausted itself. In the next episode of this series, we'll explore how ancient Greece, with a fraction of Rome's resources and territory, managed to create an equally powerful cultural and philosophical legacy. As a small Mediterranean peninsula, it gave rise to concepts of democracy, philosophy, and art that continue to define our understanding of what it means to be human. And this journey through the real Rome made you think about our own society in new ways. Leave your comment below. Tell us what aspect of Roman life surprised or worried you most. Share this video with those who believe history is just about dates and names, and show them that it's actually about us, our patterns, our challenges, our possibilities. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of these journeys through time that reveal as much about our present as our past. Turn on the notification bell to be the first to know when we release new content. And remember, empires fall, but ideas, good and bad, endure. The question isn't whether our civilization will last forever. The question is, what legacy will we choose to leave when it's our turn to enter the history books? And